Thank you very much all for allowing us to join today. My name is Jim Hutcherson. I am the Chief Technology Architect for Capgemini Government Solutions. We're primarily focused on federal government business, but I've got probably more than 40 years of technology experience and have been in the Salesforce ecosystem since 2004 and have seen it really change over the years. I was excited about the opportunity to meet with you today. The conversations with the folks at Flowsome, we really got talking about, how does the Salesforce administrator really engage and be part of this process. So we hope today during our presentation, we're going to be able to focus not only on what the administrators do, but also the programmatic side and the developer side, but it's really from the point of view of that individual Salesforce administrator. DJ?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Hi, my name is DJ. My full name is Dipanker Jyoti. I go by DJ. I'm a Salesforce certified system and application architect, as Jim is. In addition to that, I have 13 different certifications in Salesforce and 10 in other areas such as AWS, Google, Azure, and blockchain. I currently run the global Salesforce asset division of IBM, where we build really fancy tools for IBM integrated with Salesforce. And in addition to that, me and Jim had the opportunity to write a book which goes a lot into the Salesforce architecture and also DevOps. A major portion of that will be presented here, but most importantly, I want to thank Flowsome for giving us the opportunity to really present today and have the opportunity to have you guys here to listen to us. Back to you, Jim.
So let's kick this off a little bit. When you think about Salesforce deployment, we really have a number of options in front of us. First is a declarative approach, which is really limited to the Salesforce org that you're in. It has limited features and capabilities because you really can't take advantage of the full deployment suite that's there. You certainly are easy to create them and use, but a lot of times they're very difficult to actually implement and move into production. Then, of course, you have a programmatic approach that's utilizing your development tools, your packages, as well as external capabilities. You have DX, you have scratch orgs that are available to you from a programmatic side. And the challenge there is that most administrators don't necessarily have the expertise in the tools necessary to really run and use those processes. And then, of course, you have a product, like the Flowsome product, which is a full DevOps end-to-end solution. And it's really designed to provide you with a solution that covers all user types, but also all deployment requirements. And we'll spend a little bit of time kind of walking our way through that. To start this off, we'd really like to look at the day in the life of an admin from a declarative delivery or a declarative deployment perspective. So we start the process off where we create the environment connection. So we've got our dev or our UAT connected to production, and we're getting ready to do that. We've created our change sets. We've clicked the button to do all of the dependencies. We know the tricks of the trade. We know that test classes, as an example, aren't included as part of the dependencies. So we made sure that we've added those in as well. We've uploaded those change sets into the system. We click the button to deploy, and lo and behold, we have an unsuccessful deployment. Something's missing, something's not working, there's a clash somewhere, and now we've got to figure it out. The next thing we do is really investigate what these issues are. We look at the logs to see exactly what's there. We clone our change set to create a new one. We make whatever meetings we need to have to figure out what we need to change. We break the features up into multiple change sets sometimes, and we deploy each one of them one at a time. And again, we have an unsuccessful deployment. So we're kind of right back in the same spot. We've been working, spent a lot of time to get this done. So then we said, let's use something, a little bit more out there in terms of new technology. Let's create an unmanaged package in Salesforce. We've resolved the compile errors and dependencies again. We upload the package, and then we go to install that package in our target org, and we run into the exact same process. We've got an unsuccessful deployment just because the environment that we're in just isn't quite matching up the way that we want. So with that, we're like, okay, now we're really frustrated. We're trying to figure out how in the world can we get this done? And We combine change sets, we use managed packages, we make all the different corrections and changes in the orgs. We do the pre and the post deployment steps. We get everything done. We document all the steps so that we can follow up with everything to make sure that it's going to work correctly. And we hit the deploy button once again, and sometimes it will deploy, sometimes it doesn't. So the deployment is still missing things. There's a lot of work that we have to do. And this typical life as a declarative admin makes it really difficult for the administrative side to manage the deployment. So what I'd like to do now is kind of talk a little bit more about, okay, what are some of the realities of DevOps? DJ?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So, I mean, what Jim just showed is not a shocker, right? And if you think like you're the only one, trust me, there are more friends and family that of Salesforce that can empathize with you. But what you really thought of when you started a DevOps process is that I'm going to give this Ford supercar as a deployment delivery out to as part of the deployment. That's what you start off with, thinking that this will all go so smooth and we'll get there. By the time you do a couple of change set iterations, you do unmanaged package where it becomes a monolithic package because you have to deploy a monolithic package of unmanaged package. Then you do some IDE work, then you do all of these things, you do manual stuff. Eventually what you realize is that your first deployment, or at least your initial piece that got deployed, is really the lawnmower. And this is where we wanted to kind of make sure that kind of deep dive a little bit into what really is happening here and how we can solve for that. Jim, if we go to the next slide. So this slide specifically has a lot going on here, but however, this is more of a reference takeaway that we wanted to also present, and I'll walk through a little bit of this. We have really 6 different approaches at this particular time, and one not entirely GA, which is the 2GP managed package, but I'll go through each one of these. And the way to look at this is in a linear progression of capabilities available for your DevOps practice. We're still not talking about tools yet. This is agnostic of tool, but we'll get into the tools in the next piece. The first one we start off with is a change set. Is it configurable via Salesforce UI? Of course. Is it IP protected? Not at all. Is it upgradable? Not really. You have to do cloning, and then you have to add more items, and that's really not calling it upgradable. Yes, you can overwrite on top of anything that you've already deployed, but again, that's not the true capability of upgradable. Source code driven development, not at all. As a matter of fact, even with change set, a lot of folks, what they do is they create the change set, they go into their IDE, then they back that up into GitHub, and they think that that is the source code driven development approach, but that is really not exactly what we would call a source code driven development. The other part is, and this is the main part that differentiates change sets and also limits change set compared to all the other options. It's not independent of org family. In a sense, if you wanted to deploy from a sandbox to production, or even a developer org to another production, or really any Salesforce environment that is not connected with each other through an org family, you cannot do that. You could do that with every other option, but not change it, and that's the biggest limiting factor. A lot of times what will happen is that developers would be to explore certain things, open up a developer, sign up for a developer sandbox, they will build something out over there, and then eventually they will manually again recreate it in your sandbox because they feel like this is what it is. And there also the situation of multi-orgs where this becomes more challenging. The next one is really the IDE-based deployment. With the explosion of VS Code and everything and everybody's usability now, we also call this in our Salesforce world brute force deployment, where you are really retrieving all the metadata from the source orgs. You are cleaning that up manually. You are updating your package.xml. You're probably creating delta package.xmls, deploying multiple times, but everything is only in your head, nowhere else. And then whatever is successful, you kind of go ahead and do it into GitHub, which is not, again, another approach to kind of go about that. And it's definitely not configurable. There's no IP protection. It is not upgradable. And it's not source code driven unless you are really just, updating the code into the GitHub. Some of the next ones I'll go through a little bit quicker because you already get the idea of how this chart is laid out. The 1GP and unmanaged package. The key piece over here is that the metadata format that it currently uses is the org setup metadata format. With Salesforce DX being introduced, we have moved into Xforce format, which is a more scalable, extensible Salesforce format. However, each Salesforce org has a different format of metadata compared to how maybe DX works. This is pre-DX, and essentially whenever you use this particular packaging capability, every time you create a package, it becomes a monolithic package because it takes into all of the dependencies. Even if it's a small field somewhere, it pulls that in, and you cannot really decouple that, which allows it to get a lot of the benefits of configurable via Salesforce UI, independent of org family, but essentially not upgradable and not entirely source code driven development, because you're really just kind of putting it into a server within Salesforce that AppExchange provides for publishing unmanaged package. The next one is the managed package, but we all know that even though all of these green signs show up over here, this is really for publishing your app in an AppExchange world, where you get a lot of benefits, but the process of going through a security review and with Salesforce and publishing this for deployment is not the ideal situation. Then we get into the second generation unlock package. This is where I was talking about. This is a DX-based approach, and the DX-based approach really kind of converts your format into a Xforce format, and saves it into a GitHub or any source code repository automatically. It is not configurable at this particular point with Salesforce UI. However, with the help of DevOps tools such as Flowsum and others, there's a lot you can do in terms of point and click. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But again, in the unlock package, it's a similar version to unmanaged package, where IP protection is not there, but it is upgradable. It is source code driven. It is independent of org family. And then the 2GP managed package, which is not GA currently for publishing apps out there, and still in the works. But when it is completely GA, we assume that it will be, of course, IP protected, and it will be more than just publishing into AppExchange. It might be something that you could probably use. But again, safe harbor, a lot to come, and we are hoping that Salesforce keeps its promise on that. The next slide, Jim. So how can DevOps tools really help? Like you saw a lot of the red lights in the earlier chart. How can we turn them all into green? That's the big question. So by going through this, and Jim, if you can actually click out, yeah. So the first piece is, and you can also click out the other one, Jim, if you don't mind. There are 6 real areas that you want to take a look at when you're considering a DevOps tool. One is requirement release and planning, your delivery methodology. Your tools have to support your agile or hybrid or waterfall method or custom methodology entirely. If it is not flexible, what is going to happen is you're going to manually manage a delivery methodology and then orchestrate it with your DevOps tool separately. And when things get complex, there's no way for you to manage that. You also need the requirements management up to requirements traceability, from generating a requirement, storing the requirement, story pointing it, all of that stuff, to when it is deployed, and also showing end-to-end traceability on that. So that's definitely one thing that you want in DevOps. Also, dark launch management. The dark launches are referring to those pilot small group releases for deployment, where you are running it with only a set of users and not entirely, and you're doing a soft launch. You should have the ability where you can do a soft launch and a hard launch with a full-blown operational model, and your tool should support that. Next one is real development and configuration. This is kind of key around the source-driven development. And as I was mentioning a little bit about the DX and the unlocked packages, when a tool helps you with the unlocked packages, it makes it more point and click and makes it more applicable for you to really use a tool such as Flowsum to click through and see how you can create unlocked packages, or even just do metadata movements across orgs without using a code or ID or whatnot. Integrated branching strategies, so you know where you're saving things. This is the other one, which is the decoupled development with Scratchworks. So how many of us always complain about how provisioning Scratchworks requires you to go into an IDE and run something in VS Code and so forth? Many of the tools these days that I see, they come up with auto provisioning of Scratchworks. And also one of the other pieces that I will kind of indicate over here, there's a myth out there that for unlock packages, you have to create a scratch org. That there's half truth in that. There is certain aspects where you need to create scratch orgs, but if you don't, Salesforce creates one on behalf of you behind the scene and does quite a bit of that. So again, a little bit of a mix of the different topics here, but gives you an idea that a DevOps tool is the only source where you need to go to provision scratch orgs, and you can do that by them. Governance and testing, there should be integrated static code analysis models, any best practices that you're embedding so that it can do code scans, code runs, and run your best practices embedded in the tool. Automated testing integration so that if you wanted to connect Selenium and others. From a continuous integration on the right side over here is how do you integrate resolve code conflict and CI pipeline, the deployment. And then and from a deployment perspective, we're talking about the structured deployment, automated data seeding and migrations, rollbacks and recovery, which is another key one. You try to move something there and they're not ready, or maybe you're not ready with what is expected result, and you quickly want to bring back all the users in production back to whatever they were working with. If you try to do this manually, you can only imagine these are days and days of work, whereas a tool can help you because they create snapshots of every org shapes and essentially can bring that back. Continuous monitoring, this is always overlooked in any DevOps strategy. You think you deployed and you are kind of sipping your tequila or margarita or whatever in the beach, and suddenly they're like, audit folks come in, say, hey, you delivered something in the production. What happened? Can you give us a result? What was deployed? And you're doing it after the fact, recreating it, whereas you can do it as part of the process and get it through. With that said, Jim, these are the DevOps piece, but Jim, I'll let you kind of speak through some of the DevOps approach that goes along with the tool selection. Back to you.
No, thank you. So when you think about the overall DevOps approach, one of the things that we really focused on in kind of assessing and looking at the overall DevOps framework was really 6 primary areas. First is, as DJ talked about, the environment that the application is going to be moved into, running into, the org shape, all of that are very difficult to know. And it's going to be very difficult for you to understand how that release process is going to impact the individual environment. If you're in a single org, that makes it easier, but in our world today, we're seeing a lot more multi-orgs. We're also seeing a lot of environments that are kind of taking advantage of the various features such as scratch orgs that DX brings to bear. So understanding the environment and how your release and DevOps process is going to support that is extremely critical. The next is, and we talked a couple of examples, the idea of risk and impact. As you do more things with Salesforce, the complexity will continue to grow, and the impact that that can have on your given application, also the overall environment and other applications, needs to really be considered and looked at. So a lot of that dark launch concept and the ability to release features without causing problems is extremely important. So it's really a critical part of the design process for DevOps, is really understanding what those risks are and then how we're going to mitigate those risks in the delivery process. Next is one that is probably the hardest to get our heads around, and that is really managing the schedule. We have to have a clear release schedule that does multiple things. First off, it has to allow the process to be fully created, structured, following all 6 of these pieces, but it also needs to be able to be quick to market and resolve and release products very quickly in a time frame where our users and our businesses are expecting things immediately or are expecting them now. So it's really that balancing act of knowing what the release schedules are, but also having in the plan a way to release things quicker, as well as having applications release over time. So scheduling is important, and you need to understand how not only to manage the schedule, but also communicate that schedule, because there's 2 things that are happening. One is you have the users who are seeing changes, and changes for the users sometimes can be very difficult to consume, but you're also looking for that speed to market. So it's kind of a 2 sides of the same coin. The next is really the pilot side. It's imperative that you run through the various scenarios, use the sandbox structures, use your Scratchworks to really understand how things are going to work through the process, set up the smoke testing, provide feedback on the application, the release features well in advance so that you're not being surprised. Next is really looking at the measurements of success for the delivery of those outcomes. So knowing what is success. So getting features to the market, getting capabilities and functionality in applications, and honestly, even creating new applications for the business to use. Each one of them should have clear outcomes that are measurable and reportable back to the business as you go through the process. And then the last element is really looking at it from the if things go wrong, how do you structure a way to roll a change back to return the environment back to the earlier version or back to the earlier environment? This really takes a lot of work. Many organizations want to shortcut the rollback process, but in reality, this is the one that is going to really be most impactful if you ever run into a situation where a release is causing damage to an existing app or the functionality has just disappeared because something went wrong, having a release plan, a rollback plan in this process is critically important. So when I look at kind of the overall structure that we've talked about today, from a declarative perspective and from a Salesforce administrator environment, these are the elements that you guys have a lot of control over on the day-to-day side. So from our perspective, having good DevOps tools like Flowsome allow you to really manage through this process from an end-to-end perspective. DJ, any comments on your side?
No, I think you covered it all. We are open to any questions that anybody would have, or Haley will push it back to you if you want to help us get some questions through.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you guys both. We really appreciate your time. So we do have a couple questions. I am going to ask a couple of them. The first one is, what is the big difference between first generation packages and second generation packages? Yeah.
And I also see a question posted out there where they talked about 2GP unlocked org dependent packages, which we'll also address. But the first question is first generation packages, second generation packages. The big real difference between the two is the metadata format in which they are packaged. And by that, I mean that the classic way is, or not exactly Salesforce classic, but the traditional way that every Salesforce org is shaped up with is in a different structure than how DX manages it, which is the X-Force format, which is a little bit more decoupled, modularized, and extensible metadata structure. And essentially, the big difference that causes for us is the versioning. So essentially, the idea of the second generation packages is to create smaller micro deployment level packages into the org. They are decoupled and breaking them into smaller packages. In the first generation packages, you don't have a choice, but it becomes a monolithic package as soon as you start looking at the dependencies, and you have to almost include the kitchen sink in there. That's the big benefit you get out of first generation, second generation. And also, I'm assuming that in the future with second generation, you'll have the capability to see more decoupling as more custom items are added by Salesforce in new releases.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to do one more question. What are some of the implications of package-based deployments using unmanaged packages?
Yeah. So, when we talk about package-based deployments, really the key is resolving certain dependencies. Now, this is a little bit different. So in the first generation packaging model, so there are only two different packaging models if we discount out the managed package part of it. The unmanaged package part of it, there are two different models, the first generation and the second generation. In the first generation, all dependencies, whether it is independent of org or not independent of org, you have to resolve them to move from one to another. So that's a big implication. But with the second generation packaging, this has become a little bit more fluid. There is a second generation packaging, which is the org dependent packaging, where you do not have to resolve any of the dependencies. You can migrate from one sandbox to the production or to sandbox, without resolving some of the dependencies. You also are not required to do some level of code coverage when you're moving from sandbox to sandbox. This could be a very essential element when you are quickly moving from one org to another without going through the process of creating the connections between the orgs. And it can be, you can also do diff compares and others in a packaging model much eloquently than you could do in chain sets or even a metadata API of sorts.